Who has questions? Oh my, there's a bunch of big questions being pasted. So Tyler's asking, there's been a few times when you've mentioned with help from the IDE as this reason for certain features being the way they are, but how do you resolve this with the fact that most IDEs suck? The way you resolve it is by making a good IDE. Now, that said, I don't think IDE in the same way. Like, as far as I'm concerned, what I really mean is text editor. Because the reason things like Visual C++ or Visual Studio, right, are so bad in so many ways, and don't even get me started on anything on Linux, is because they try to combine all this stuff that doesn't really solve very interesting problems. So part of what this language does, right, is offload some of those problems, right? Like all the stuff about organizing your project and building it and pre-build and post-build steps, all that stuff goes away from your so-called IDE because it's just part of your program, right? And we'll look at a more serious version of that next week again. And you know, the more that you get rid of, the better a job you can do on what's there, right? So you want to edit your program, and you want to debug your program, and you want to visualize your program. And debugging really is mostly about visualizing. So you kind of want to edit and visualize your program and visualize it during editing in a certain way that helps with editing. And then you want to debug and visualize your program. And the visualization there is maybe different. It's tuned more in a way to help you debug. But that's basically it. You don't really want anything besides those two things. Imagine if all of the manpower on the, however many people have worked on Visual Studio, imagine if they said, this program does those two things. How much better it would be. It would be way better, right? Imagine if Linux people knew anything about user experience and cared, then they'd be way better, right? But nobody... Anyway, I don't think it's that hard. Now that said, maybe I'm going to be too busy to make such a good IDE. I don't know. So will it happen? You know, we have to call these things as we come to them, right? We have to see how the language is working in the wild. Any thing that I say about this is the way certain features are is provisional, right? It'll get changed if it needs to get changed in order to be better. Okay. On the subject of $, you want a distinction between compile time arguments and runtime arguments. You could use the less and greater than. No. I mean, the brackets, I don't know. I think they're kind of ugly and unreadable, and they don't really solve the problem that I was talking about, because in this language, it's not like there's only template parameters or runtime parameters. There's mixed parameter lists in this language, right? You have, here's a parameter list, and this one element is baked, but the other ones aren't, right? So it's a more versatile thing than in C++, but it also means that the syntax requirements would be different. Now, maybe you can use angle brackets in some way, but probably not in exactly the C++ way. Like maybe you put the name of that particular parameter in angle brackets, but if you're going to do that, I'd pick different punctuation. I don't think greater than less than should be used that way. It's just, they're for math, man. They're for math. For make function example, would type entity work, since rock monster, etc. aren't derived from entity, but instead, I think it should work. Let's try it. If it doesn't work, it's a compiler bug. Now the thing you already saw from one, I think it was a compiler. I didn't even want to stop to verify it was a compiler bug or if I messed up the program in some simple way, but I've been doing a little bit less. You know, normally before I give a demo, I go way through and really thoroughly test the compiler in all sorts of different cases that I don't even show during the demo, just to make sure it's really working and stuff. But as the language gets relatively settled, I'm doing a little bit less of that so that I have more time to go out into applications and program actual software in the language, right? Which is what we'll be looking at next week. So now that doesn't mean the stuff won't get nailed down. It just means I don't nail it down as soon as I normally do. So this is a little risky, but the questioner is asking, oh, you know what? That actually, it's actually, I can't do this experiment because it's a different syntax. So the syntax that's being talked about is this: type check the argument to see if it's a table. You could do this, I guess. No, you can't. Okay, this is not right because the type of this argument, whoops, I undid too far, thanks you, Max. The type of this argument is always type, right? So, sorry, I didn't eat enough cookies and my brain sugar is low. So the type of this argument isn't an entity. This is a actual type, right? And you don't want to pass you could pass an entity value to this, but this is making the entity value. You don't have it yet, right? So the goal of this function is just pass the type argument and get the entity value. So it's a slightly different situation. It might be confusing if you're just watching this at first, but it becomes very clear after just a little bit. Why doesn't cast pointer to door E work? Because, okay, I'll show you why. I mean, if I was Casey, I would draw a diagram, but I don't have a tablet hooked up. Because there's two completely different chunks of memory, okay? So let me move door up so we can look at door next to entity, right? So when I call make, right? When I call make on this type door, I get back a pointer to door, right? So that is giving me the pointer to basically the head of this struct, right? Which includes this pointer here and all these data elements, right? So that should be obvious, hopefully, right? Now, when I put it in this array, it's actually getting casted downward, upward, whatever, I don't know. I think of it as downward to pointer to entity, which involves following this point or taking the value of this pointer, basically, right? So now what gets stored in this array doesn't know about this at all. It only knows about the pointer to this. So it's pointing at memory that starts with position, flags, entity ID, entity type, and derived pointer. But the compiler doesn't know what derived pointer means. So you have no automatic way of getting back there, right? So if you want to get back there, that's what this down function is for, right? It takes me from the pointer to essentially the pointer to the position, right? Because that's what's at the start of entity, to the pointer to the entity pointer and all this other stuff, right? So down casts based on the derived pointer, and derived pointer gets set here, right? So when I'm going to make a new door or whatever type, I say new door, right? So new door has all this memory, but it doesn't contain memory for this stuff. It's just got a pointer to that stuff, right? This stuff gets allocated here. And then I set up the pointer, both pointers to point at each other, right? So the derived pointer points down at door, right? And then, well, the doors pointer gets set here in the new, right? So I don't have to, that's the explicit assignment of that pointer. Now, why do you do that? Well, you can set up your entity system however you want, right? This particular one, I want to make memory efficient in a certain way that my previous engines were not, and that caused me to be unhappy. So that's why. This takes a little bit more memory than the C++ version, right? The C++ version would not have that pointer, and it effectively would dump all this stuff there, right? So we've got storage for both of these things, plus an extra pointer, plus whatever little overhead our allocators have, which is hopefully close to 0 if they're good allocators. But in terms of runtime performance, this is often going to be very superior for the kinds of tasks that you do when you're manipulating a world state. Hopefully that answered your question, Grumpy Giant 256. Wait, is that? Okay, I think I know who you are. Hopefully that answered your question. I don't know if it did. Can you call things like is unsigned int at compile time? If you wanted to restrict the argument types of a struct function, you totally could. In fact, All that modify stuff that I demoed, I believe works. I didn't test it for this demo because I have other things to do and I didn't need it. But in theory, you could do modify, key type equals whatever of key type, right? And whatever can be some function that changes key type. It could be a function that asserts that key type is of a certain kind of thing and generates a compile error if not. All that stuff. I did a whole like hour-and-a-half long demo of all this stuff. All of that works for structs as well. So yeah. All of that works in theory for structs. I'm not brave enough to try it right now because it might have broken since I typed it in. That's the only reason I'm not doing it. One thing is nice about enums instead of types is that the range of enum values is limited. Yeah, I mentioned that actually. Well, I mentioned it in the form of the size of the value, but it's the same thing, right? In Clang, you can make sure all possible type values you expect to have to handle, blah, blah, blah. So again, this may be something that you'll have more information on how I'm thinking about it next week when we do the real application-oriented thing. But essentially, I think in a lot of cases where you want that kind of complete coverage, like I want to make sure that every entity type is included in this current thing, that could be handled in a different way. Or actually, I haven't done switch statements yet. So switch statements probably will work on types. I don't see why not. They should at least work on all kinds of primitive constants that the language supports, and I would consider types to be one of those. So you might be able to annotate a switch statement and say this should include all subtypes of entity. And certainly, if that's not supported by the syntax of the switch statement, you could put a note in there that is then handled by your own compile time metaprogram. So this will be covered one way or another. Don't worry about it. The question is just, in what way does it get covered? Someone's asking, what's that Sudoku game? I haven't been showing off a Sudoku game. I don't know what you're talking about. Why not make the type of derived pointer be a type parameter of entity so that you don't have to cast at all? Because you have to cast. So he's saying, why don't you do this? Like, struct derived. Let me know if I'm understanding the question, but I think you're asking this. Why don't you do this? Derived type is a type, right? And then when you make entity, then this is a pointer to derived type. You certainly could make this, right? That's fine. The problem is then, though, that every subentity is going to be of a different type here, and that defeats the point, right? This parameters make it a different type, right? Now, there's some features we might have later where you could deal with the commonality between different types that use different parameters, but you wouldn't be able to put these guys. I mean, I'm not going to rat hole on that. Assume we don't have that kind of thing. You couldn't then put these guys into a strongly typed array because they're different types of entity, right? One has some parameters, one has other parameters, and they're just not the same type anymore, right? So this would not be useful. You could do it, but it would not serve the purpose of the whole point right? The whole reason that I want something called entity is so that I can do stuff like just have an array of these guys, right? Or return an entity from a function, and the function doesn't know what type it is, right? That's why I do this. So if you're not used to a lot of compile time type determination kinds of things, you might not just have that kind of thought pattern down. But the usefulness of entity is that it's not a different type per subclass, right? Does this language support fixed size headerless arrays? Yes, it has for a very long time. Early on, I discussed closures, but it's been a long time since I talked about it at all. Is it still something I'm interested in working into the language? There's two parts to this question, so I'm going to answer the first part about closures. I think closures are still on the table. I just don't need them for anything I'm doing right now, and I think all these features that I'm doing right now are way more important. I think I'm going to do closures. I have a good idea of how I'm going to do them, or at least a lot of, I have the starting idea for how they're going to get done. So there probably will be in the language. And in fact, a different project of mine that I would like to port over to this language uses closures kind of a lot. So that'll be a good workhorse for it. But I'm, as always, I'm approaching features in priority order. I'm trying to hit the big ones first and the other ones later. And I just don't feel like closures are that important, despite the fact that I went to school for computer science at UC Berkeley, where they teach you that closures are great. I actually, they're fine. They're a cool feature, but they're not as amazing as some people would have you believe. And then the other part of the question is just how close to my initial ideas do I feel I've gotten? Well, my initial ideas, if you go back and looked at the first two talks before I was really building this stuff and doing demos, the ideas were not as good as what is here now. And that's always a good sign. It's the same with designing a game. When you end up designing things that are better than your initial ideas, then you win, right? That's how you know you're really onto something. And so here, all of the stuff that I've been showing in all these demos is either better than the initial things, right, or implements those initial things. So it's great. I'm very happy with it. Am I going to open source the language? Yes, eventually. Not yet, when it's ready. Will it be part of the spec that compiler authors are not allowed to add optimizations that break code, like assuming signed integer overflow is not a thing? Yes. What it'll be is just the spec. The spec tells you what happens, and what you do is you just write the best spec that you can. And so first of all, from the problems that we've seen in C and C++, we have a good idea of what some of those problems are, so we can make sure to attack those in the initial spec. However, you can't foresee everything, right? And compiler writers seem to be a particularly desperate crew, so they'll come up with something eventually that's going to break honest people's programs, hardworking people's programs. So, but the way that I handle that is just there's different revisions of the language, and they're not even necessarily backwards compatible. It's a DirectX model as opposed to a C++ model. So what I'm working toward now is version 1 of the language, and it's going to have a certain, we're probably never really going to write the spec too formally for version 1. As the language gets totally solidified, right, it'll have a spec as you need one, because you need to know what the semantics of the language are to write correct programs, right? But if something in that spec is unfortunate or leads to more ambiguity than we would like, or causes problems, or was the wrong decision, right? Part of the problem is like, well, we don't want to define behavior in this case because we might make the wrong decision. If we make the wrong decision, we'll just change it next time. We'll change it in version 3, and you could stay with version 2 if you've got legacy code or something, and it's fine. I feel like the DirectX model worked very well in games, and I think people ought to use it more. Yeah. Someone's asked, Garlando Bloom asks, is there a way to just ask if X is less than Y less than Z? No, I don't chain together operators that way right now. Could do it, not that important. The thing I want all the time actually is if something is equal to any of the following 5 things, right? Instead of saying X is equal to A, or X is equal to B, or X, right? So some languages have like a pattern matching if it's a member of this array or something. So who knows? Might do that. I don't know. Does the compiler currently compile C or bytecode? I'm not going to answer that. It's been answered many times, and you can see it happen in many previous demos. So you can go watch those if you're interested. Part of me thinks eventually we'll be writing mathematical formalism and not worry about implementation details like memory layout. But obviously there are gains now to be had from doing things efficiently. Do you think that need will go away? No, not anytime, not in my lifetime it won't. It's totally obvious, right? Like even today, software is so slow and so crappy and so terrible. And I gave a speech about this at the UC Berkeley CSUA. I've given 2 speeches at CSUA, but the most recent one, the one from 2016, I go into this subject at great length. But basically, the things we have today are giant, massive supercomputers compared to, for example, when I was in college. And yet software is just really as slow as ever, and it's not even doing that much more. It's just programming has gotten crappier, right? Because people are following this idea that they don't have to worry about these kinds of issues, of speed and memory and stuff, but they clearly do because things are so crappy. So if you're interested in that, you can look up the whole rant. Maybe somebody has the link handy and can paste it into the chat. I don't know. Oh, someone suggested using the double colon for baking. I hadn't thought of that for some reason. That might work, and it might look very nice. My only question is that might be too low-key. Like, it might be easy to miss. But maybe we'll make it triple colon. Maybe we'll make it, maybe your IDE just makes it highlighted. I don't know. That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, someone's asking if you could put that unfound value for the hash table in the initialization list, like as a constant parameter. Could you put this here? Yes, you could, I think. No, not exactly. You couldn't. You would have to do it in a set. So the thing is, this, I don't know. Maybe if I did a little more compiler work, you could do that. So what's being asked is if I could do this. And I don't think that the compiler will understand how to do this right now. But it might be that it's not that hard to make it happen, right? The reason is just that it needs to do this type check before it's instantiated this struct. Like looking up these names in those scopes is how it does all this. And there's no scope before you've instantiated this struct, which is when it's doing the type check. So this would not work right now unless, so you could make this happen. If you wanted this to be a compile time thing, you could do a modify. You could do this. Sorry, unfound value is some mysterious type T, which you modify like it's not, wait. I don't have enough blood sugar right now. That's not the right thing either. No, I don't know. Anyway, it should be, the most straightforward thing is as we typed it here. And I don't know if that's important to make the compiler understand that. And I don't know if, you know, sometimes you think, oh, we ought to do that. And then you look at the implications of that in terms of the rest of the language, and it turns out not to be simple. So I'm not going to promise supporting that either. But if that's something people want to do, we could maybe do it. I just didn't do it this time. When I introspect a struct, how do I distinguish between type parameters and members of type? There's flagged. There's just a, so when you introspect a struct, it's, no, I don't have that loaded. Modules, right? You get a declaration thing, and I guess I haven't exported this flag yet. But there's going to be a flag in this list that's like is baked or something, right? And that'll be available for both procedure arguments and struct arguments, and so you can tell. But also for structs, you would at least already, before I export that flag, you would know that they're constant and that they don't take storage. That's easy to see, right? The thing is just whether you care that it's an argument or not. Someone is pseudonym 73 says one of the issues with a type as a word that you often see in real programs is that it tends not to play nice with separate compilation units and especially dynamic libraries. What is the plan for this? I don't necessarily see that as introducing any problems that I don't already have. So first of all, there just aren't separate compilation units in the way that you think of them. That's just not a thing. I think that that is responsible for causing a large number of issues with languages like C and C++, for example, and causing the language semantics to be quite painful to use on a day-to-day basis. So that doesn't exist. For all I care, you're just compiling a whole program every time. There's one compilation unit. Now, how to deal with DLLs is a little bit of a, or you know, SO files or whatever they are on your operating system of choice. That's a little bit of a separate issue. I haven't completely thought through it, but there has to be something type related that already negotiates that. Because, for example, if you remember, we already have, we're supposed to have this array of type info structs. Note I'm still using enums for all this stuff because it's old code. I probably would just have type values here. But remember, we have all these, and these are supposed to be uniquely represented in the types array. So if you load a DLL, you have to like generate a new type table that is uniqueified already. And that's actually harder, I think, than this other thing. Maybe it's the same. I don't know. But so that just already has to be solved, so it'll be fine. Wow, there's a lot of questions. I'm only going to do a couple more questions because it's time for me to go, but let me just scan for the appealing questions. Have I looked at liquid types, aka refinement types? I have no idea what that is. Have I hired or found someone to make the back end? Not yet, still looking. If you want to work on compilers and you're a very experienced game programmer and you know about both how to do game engines and fast software, and you also know a little bit about compilers at least, I would much rather have the game experience than the compiler experience actually, because games are a lot harder than compilers. And you know, compilers are learnable. So yeah, let me know if you want a job. Email that address. But don't let me know if you're an enthusiastic beginner. Please, is experienced people only. Thank you. Someone says they're worried about the number of features in a language that's not even 1.0 yet. Maybe it would be nice to fix some subset. It's fine. I mean, it's you know, it's going to be a little bit. It's more complicated than C, but vastly less complicated than C++. And we're coming toward the end of major features, I'll say that, right? The features that we add are going to be smaller and smaller as time goes on. But also, this is sort of the minimum set of what I wanted to do, what I want to program with from day to day. I don't see the point in, you know, starting with a language that's maybe a little too simple and trivial that people don't really want to use, and then building up from there. Like I want to hit with like, this is a good language that handles what you want to do and it does it well, right? And then from there, we can see how to evolve the language. So yes, as things get more complicated, it takes more work to make them work well, right? But that's going to be fine. It's going to be less work to make this language work well than it was to build the game that I and my team just shipped. So I even said games are hard. Compilers are much easier. Joke questions. People are asking joke questions. All right, I think that's it. Thank you, everybody, for coming out and watching, and thank you 227 of you for sticking through the Q&A. And like I said, I want to do the next one soon. I've got a few new things to program, but hopefully in a week or so we'll do another one. So goodbye and see you soon.